The morning Tosin Adeyemi-Okafor asked her husband for a divorce, the chandeliers in their Lekki mansion glittered like witnesses to a crime no one else could see, and by sunset, Lagos high society would begin whispering about a marriage that had looked too perfect to fail. If you're new to this channel, just subscribe now, and say it in the comment section. Chief Emeka Okafor was the kind of man whose name opened doors before he even arrived. In boardrooms from Victoria Island to Abuja, executives lowered their voices when he spoke. Oil contracts seemed to bend toward him. Real estate developers waited months for a 5-minute audience. His mansion in Lekki stood tall behind sculpted hedges and iron gates, a white and gold masterpiece that people slowed their cars to admire. And always, at his side, stood Tosin. She was elegant, wrapped in silk and confidence. Tall, poised, with a smile that photographers loved and society envied. At charity galas, she glided through crowds in designer gowns, greeting senators and CEOs by first name. On social media, carefully curated photos showed candlelit dinners, yacht weekends, and coordinated outfits that screamed perfection. "God really took his time with you too," one pastor once said during their anniversary Thanksgiving. The congregation laughed in agreement. But perfection, like glass, cracks quietly. Behind the polished marble floors and imported Italian furniture, silence had begun to settle into their home. It started subtly, Emeka coming home later than usual. Tosin spending more weekends in Abuja for foundation work. Conversations that once stretched past midnight reduced to practical exchanges. "Will you be home for dinner?" Tosin would ask without looking up from her phone. "I have a meeting," Emeka would reply, already loosening his tie. Separate bedrooms followed soon after. At first, it was for better sleep. Then it became routine. Still, in public, they performed flawlessly. On a humid Saturday evening, they hosted a fundraiser in their garden. Fairy lights hung from palm trees. A live band played soft high-life music. Guests sipped champagne beneath white canopies. Tosin wore a silver gown that shimmered under the lights, her hand resting gently on Emeka's arm as they posed for photographs. "You two are the definition of power couple," a young entrepreneur gushed. Emeka smiled politely. Tosin laughed, that practiced, melodic laugh. No one noticed the way their fingers barely touched. Later that night, after the last guest left and the staff cleared the tables, Tosin stood alone by the pool, staring at the water. Emeka joined her, hands in his pockets. "You were impressive tonight," he said. "So were you," she replied, her tone neutral. A long silence stretched between them. "Emeka," she began, still looking at the water, "when last were we happy?" He didn't answer immediately. "We are successful," he said finally. "That's not what I asked." He exhaled slowly. "Happiness is a luxury. Stability is what matters." Tosin turned to face him. "I don't want to be stable. I want to be alive." He studied her expression, searching for something he could fix with money, influence, or strategy. But this wasn't a business negotiation. Weeks passed with that conversation lingering in the air. They moved around each other like polite strangers. Their 8-year-old son, Jide, sensed the shift even if he couldn't name it. "Why doesn't Daddy eat with us anymore?" he asked one evening. Tosin forced a smile. "Daddy is busy building your future." Emeka overheard from the hallway and paused, guilt tightening his chest before he pushed it aside. One Tuesday morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows of the breakfast room. The table was set with fresh fruit, croissants, and coffee. Tosin sat upright, composed, dressed in a cream blouse and tailored trousers. She looked less like a wife and more like a woman attending a board meeting. Emeka entered, scanning emails on his tablet. "Morning." "Good morning," she replied calmly. He poured coffee, added no sugar, and finally looked up. Something in her stillness made him pause. "We need to talk," she said. He gave a faint smile. "That sounds serious." "It is." He set the tablet down slowly. "All right." Tosin folded her hands on the table. No tremor. No hesitation. I want a divorce, Emeka. The words landed softly but carried the weight of an explosion. He stared at her, searching for anger, drama, emotion. There was none. Is this about the argument last week? He asked. It's about the last 3 years. He leaned back in his chair. Marriage has seasons, Tosin. This season feels like a lifetime. He remained silent. I refuse to spend the rest of my life in a house that feels like a hotel lobby, she continued. We coexist. We don't connect. And divorce will fix that, he asked quietly. It will free me. The air between them felt heavy, but neither raised their voice. What exactly are you asking for? Emeka said, his tone shifting into something more measured. Tosin met his gaze directly. Half of everything. There it was. Clear. Direct. Half, he repeated. Yes. The companies. The properties. The investments. I built this life with you. I stood beside you when you had one contract and a borrowed office. He didn't deny it. And I want custody of Jide, she added. With reasonable access for you. Emeka's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You think separating him from me is reasonable? I think stability is, she said. You're always working. He looked away briefly, then back at her. Is this about money, Tosin? It's about fairness. The room fell silent again. Outside, a gardener trimmed hedges as though nothing monumental was happening inside. Emeka lifted his coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it down carefully. If that's what you want, he said evenly, then we'll do it properly. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You're not going to argue? No. You're not going to try to convince me to stay. If your mind is made up, persuasion is pointless. His calmness unsettled her more than anger would have. I've already spoken to a lawyer, she said. I assumed you had. Another pause. I won't walk away with nothing, Emeka, Tosin said firmly. You won't walk away dishonoured, he replied. That's all I can promise. She stood, smoothing invisible creases from her trousers. My lawyers will contact yours. He nodded once. As she walked toward the door, she stopped briefly. For what it's worth, I did love you. He looked at her, expression unreadable. I know. She left the room without another word. Emeka remained seated long after she disappeared upstairs. The mansion was quiet, but not peaceful. He picked up his tablet, stared at the blank screen, then placed it back down. From the hallway, laughter echoed, Jide playing with his tutor. Emeka closed his eyes for a moment, his face composed, controlled. Outside, the sun continued to shine over Lekki. Cars passed their gates. Life moved forward. Inside the mansion, a marriage that Lagos envied had officially ended, not with shouting or broken plates, but with two calm voices across a breakfast table dividing a kingdom built together. And neither of them yet understood how expensive that calm would become. By the time Tosin's divorce filing reached the High Court in Lagos, the news had already outrun the paperwork. In Ikoyi lounges and Victoria Island boardrooms, whispers moved faster than official statements. The golden couple was splitting. And not quietly. At RSVP that Friday night, two oil executives leaned across a polished table. I heard she's asking for half, one murmured. Half, the other scoffed. Of Emeka Okafor's empire? That's not a settlement. That's a takeover. Meanwhile, Tosin sat in a private office overlooking Marina, her posture straight as her legal team spread documents across a long mahogany table. Barrister Akin Fashler adjusted his glasses. Madam, we are not approaching this emotionally. We are approaching this strategically. I'm not emotional, Tosin replied coolly. I'm prepared. Another lawyer slid a document toward her. We've itemized everything we can verify: oil holdings, construction subsidiaries, real estate portfolios in Lekki, Banana Island, Abuja, even the London apartment. Tosin scanned the figures. Even she felt the weight of the numbers. "You're confident?" she asked. Akin gave a measured nod. "Under Nigerian matrimonial law, long-term marriage, shared lifestyle, joint public representation, we have grounds to demand equal division. Especially given your documented involvement in his brand development and social positioning." Tosin allowed herself a small smile. "Good." "And custody?" another associate asked. "I want primary custody," she said firmly. "Jide needs stability." Across town, in a quieter office on Adola Odeku Street, Emeka sat opposite his own legal counsel. Barrister Ifunanya Obi did not waste words. She was precise, composed, and known in legal circles for dismantling opponents without raising her voice. "She's requesting 50% of all verifiable marital assets," Ifunanya said calmly, "including operational control in certain subsidiaries." Emeka listened without visible reaction. "And custody of Jide?" he asked. "Primary custody, with you granted scheduled access." A faint exhale left his nose, almost a laugh, but not quite. "What is our position?" he asked. Ifunanya met his gaze. "Our position is strong." "That's not what I asked." She paused briefly. "Our documentation is intact. Every structural adjustment you made over the past 5 years was legally compliant and properly filed." Emeka leaned back slightly. "No procedural gaps. None that can be exploited." Silence filled the office. "Ifunanya," he said quietly, "this must remain dignified." "Of course. No mudslinging. No character attacks." Her eyebrow lifted slightly. "Even if provoked?" "Especially if provoked." She nodded once. "Understood." The first court hearing drew an audience that looked more like a business summit than a legal proceeding. Socialites disguised curiosity as concern. Bloggers lurked outside hoping for photographs. Tosin arrived in a navy blue suit, sunglasses shielding her eyes from camera flashes. Her expression was controlled, almost regal. Behind her, Barrister Akin carried a leather briefcase thick with files. Minutes later, Emeka stepped out of a black SUV. No sunglasses. No visible tension. Just a dark grey suit and the calm gait of a man heading into a scheduled meeting. Inside the courtroom, murmurs quieted as they took their seats on opposite sides. The judge entered. Proceedings began. Barrister Akin stood first. "My lord, this is a straightforward matter of equitable distribution. My client dedicated 12 years of marriage to Chief Emeka Okafor. She contributed socially, strategically, and domestically to the growth of his enterprises. We are requesting a fair division, 50% of all marital assets, shared custody arrangements weighted in favor of maternal stability, and appropriate financial maintenance." He spoke confidently, pacing slowly. "We have documentation of joint appearances, co-signed investments, and evidence of lifestyle integration that reflects shared ownership." He submitted a thick file to the court clerk. Tosin kept her chin slightly lifted. Gasps echoed faintly as figures were read aloud, billions in asset valuations. Across the aisle, Emeka remained still, hands folded neatly. The judge turned toward Ifunanya. "Counsel." She rose gracefully. "My lord, while we acknowledge the duration of the marriage, the characterization of these assets as jointly held is inaccurate." A faint ripple of curiosity moved through the courtroom. "If I may," she continued, "the majority of Chief Okafor's operational companies are not held in his personal capacity." She handed a separate folder to the clerk. "They are under irrevocable trusts, established years prior to this filing." Barrister Akin frowned. "My lord, that is a diversion." "If I may finish," Ifunanya said evenly. The judge gestured for her to proceed. "These trusts were legally constituted, documented, and registered. They are independent legal entities. Chief Okafor does not personally own controlling shares in the manner being implied. The courtroom shifted uneasily. Tosin's eyes flickered toward Emeka for the first time. Ifunanya continued. Additionally, several real estate properties referenced by opposing counsel were transferred into long-term estate protection structures well before marital dissolution discussions. Barrister Akin stood quickly. My lord, we contest the timing and intention behind these transfers. And you are free to examine the dates, Ifunanya replied without raising her voice. All filings predate the divorce request. The judge adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. A low murmur spread across the gallery. Tosin leaned toward her lawyer. What is she talking about? Akin's jaw tightened. We'll address it. Emeka sat motionless, gaze fixed forward. The judge looked up. Counsel, are you suggesting that Chief Okafor personally owns very little of what has been presented? Ifunanya nodded. Precisely, my lord. A wave of disbelief passed through spectators. How is that possible? Someone whispered from the back row. Tosin's composure wavered for a fraction of a second. The judge tapped his pen thoughtfully. This court will require full transparency of all trust documents and asset transfers. They are prepared, Ifunanya replied. The session adjourned temporarily for document review. In the corridor outside, reporters attempted to approach Tosin. Madam, are the rumors true that the assets aren't directly in his name? She ignored them. Inside a quiet side room, Tosin faced Akin. You assured me everything was joint, she said sharply. We based our assessment on public filings, he replied carefully. We did not anticipate this level of structural shielding. Her voice lowered but hardened. Are you telling me he planned this? We need to examine the timelines. Across the hall, Emeka stood by a window overlooking the busy street below. Ifunanya joined him. She didn't know, she observed. No, he said calmly. You understand this will escalate. It already has. She studied him briefly. You're remarkably composed. He gave a faint, almost tired smile. Preparation removes panic. Back inside the courtroom, proceedings resumed. The judge cleared his throat. This matter is more complex than initially presented. The court will reconvene in 2 weeks after thorough review of these submitted documents. The gavel struck. As people filed out, whispers intensified. He moved everything. Before she filed. Is that even legal? Tosin walked ahead without looking back. Emeka followed moments later, cameras flashing again. One reporter shouted, Chief, are you losing half your fortune? He paused briefly, glancing toward the lens. Fortune, he said calmly, is a matter of perspective. Then he stepped into his vehicle and the door closed softly. Across Lagos that evening, conversations buzzed. At a private dinner in Banana Island, a senator leaned toward his wife. That man is not as simple as he looks. In her bedroom later, Tosin stood before her mirror, removing her earrings slowly. Her reflection stared back at her, not defeated, but unsettled. She had expected resistance. She had not expected architecture. And somewhere in the city, in an office lit only by a desk lamp, Barrister Ifunanya organized the next set of documents she intended to present. The demand had been bold. But the response had been calculated. And Lagos was beginning to realize that this divorce was not going to be the clean division anyone predicted. The second hearing drew an even larger crowd. By now, the divorce of Chief Emeka Okafor and Tosin Adeyemi-Okafor was no longer private misfortune, it was elite entertainment. Lawyers from other firms slipped into the back rows under the guise of professional interest. Society columnists waited outside pretending not to stare. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavier than before. Tosin arrived earlier this time. She wore white, crisp, controlled, deliberate. Her face was calm, but her fingers tightened slightly around her handbag when she noticed the number of observers. Barrister Akin leaned toward her. We reviewed the trust documents. They're sophisticated, but not untouchable. Meaning, she asked quietly. Meaning we will question intent. A few minutes later, Emeka entered with Ifunanya. No theatrics. No visible strain. He nodded politely toward acquaintances who tried to read his expression. When proceedings began, the judge wasted no time. I have reviewed preliminary submissions regarding the asset structures, he said. Counsel for the respondent, you may clarify the ownership framework. Ifunanya stood smoothly. My lord, the narrative being presented suggests concealment. That is inaccurate. What exists here is long-term estate planning. She walked toward the evidence table. 5 years ago, Chief Okafor established 3 irrevocable trusts, the Okafor Energy Trust, the Atlantic Infrastructure Trust, and the Jide Legacy Trust. Murmurs filled the room at the last name. These trusts were designed for operational continuity and generational wealth protection. They were executed with independent trustees and audited annually. Barrister Akin rose quickly. My lord, estate planning cannot be used as a shield to deprive a spouse of rightful entitlement. And it is not, Ifunanya replied calmly. But one cannot divide what is not personally owned. The judge gestured for documentation. Clerks distributed copies. Pages flipped rapidly. Dates were examined. Akin stepped forward. My lord, we challenge the timing. These trusts were formed during the marriage. Yes, Ifunanya agreed, but not in anticipation of divorce. They were part of corporate restructuring following regulatory changes in the oil sector. She handed forward correspondence from years prior, board resolutions, advisory memos, tax restructuring notices. The judge studied them carefully. Tosin's gaze shifted toward Emeka again. This time, there was something sharper in it. When the court paused briefly for review, she leaned toward her lawyer. He never told me about any of this. Akin kept his voice low. Legally, he wasn't required to disclose estate structures if he retained no direct ownership. Her jaw tightened. We attended trustee dinners together. Yes, Akin said carefully, as beneficiaries' representatives. The word settled heavily. Back in session, Akin tried a new angle. My lord, even if operational ownership rests within trusts, lifestyle evidence demonstrates shared control and benefit. The respondent lives in the mansion. He drives the cars. He manages the companies. Ifunanya didn't wait long to respond. Living in a trust-owned property does not equate to personal ownership. Managing a company as an appointed executive does not equal holding divisible equity. She stepped closer to the judge's bench. My lord, this is not a case of hidden money. This is a case of legal foresight. The courtroom quieted. The judge adjusted his glasses again. Counsel for the petitioner, do you have evidence that these trusts were fraudulently constituted? Akin hesitated, just briefly. We are investigating potential bad faith. Investigate quickly, the judge replied. Because thus far, the documentation appears compliant. A faint shift moved through the gallery. Tosin felt it. The tide. When the session broke for lunch recess, she stepped into a private consultation room with Akin and 2 associates. This is not how this was supposed to go, she said, voice controlled but edged. We anticipated complexity, Akin replied. You anticipated paperwork. This is something else. He took a breath. He's structured his wealth in layers. Personal accounts show moderate liquidity. Operational profits flow into trust vehicles. Translate, she demanded. On paper, he is wealthy in influence, not in divisible cash. Her silence stretched. One associate spoke carefully. Madam, if we cannot penetrate the trusts, the focus shifts to maintenance settlements and custody leverage. Tosin turned sharply. I am not here for allowance money. Across the corridor, Emeka stood alone near a window. Ifunanya approached with a file. "She's realizing," she said quietly. "I never intended humiliation," he replied. "You intended protection." "Yes." She studied him. "Do you regret not telling her?" He took a moment before answering. "She never asked about structures. She asked about results." Back in court, proceedings resumed with financial experts called to clarify valuation mechanisms. An accountant explained the distinction between beneficial interest and legal title. Another detailed fiduciary obligations that prevented unilateral liquidation. Each explanation chipped away at the simplicity Tosin had expected. Finally, the judge leaned back. "This court acknowledges the complexity of modern wealth structures," he said. "However, we must determine whether equitable relief can be granted despite legal separation of ownership." He looked toward Tosin. "Madam, did you have direct managerial authority within these trusts?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I represented the family publicly." "That was not my question." "No," she admitted. "Did you sign trustee directives?" "No." The judge nodded slowly. Across the aisle, Emeka remained still, but his eyes briefly softened, not with victory, but with something heavier. As arguments continued into late afternoon, the atmosphere shifted from spectacle to tension. Observers realized this was no ordinary division of mansions and bank accounts. This was chess. And one player had moved years before the other entered the board. When adjournment was finally announced, the judge summarized carefully. "The court requires full disclosure of beneficiary structures and cash flow allocations within the trusts. Additionally, we will examine any personal accounts held independently of these entities." Gavel down. Outside, reporters pressed forward again. "Madam Tosin, do you believe assets were hidden from you?" She stopped briefly this time. "I believe," she said evenly, "that marriages require transparency." She stepped into her waiting car. Emeka exited moments later. "Chief, did you plan this to avoid paying your wife?" someone shouted. He paused, expression unreadable. "I planned my future," he said quietly. That night, in her private sitting room, Tosin stared at stacks of copied documents spread across a glass table. Dates. Signatures. Trust deeds. Her own signature appeared on some pages, acknowledging attendance, not ownership. She picked up one document and read the clause slowly. Irrevocable. Non-transferable. Independent governance. Her reflection in the dark window looked different now, not confident, not triumphant. Calculating. Across the city, Emeka sat in his study reviewing the next phase of disclosures with Ifunanya. "Once beneficiary distributions are clarified," she said, "the focus will shift." "To what?" he asked. She closed the file gently. "To conduct." Silence settled between them. In that silence lay the next move, one neither the public nor Tosin yet fully understood. The hidden architecture of wealth had been revealed. But the foundation of trust within the marriage was about to face examination far more personal than financial statements. By the third month, the divorce was no longer just about money. It was about credibility. The courtroom felt different that morning, quieter, tighter, as though everyone sensed something irreversible was approaching. The earlier hearings had been technical, layered with corporate language and trust law. Today carried a sharper edge. Tosin entered with less theatrical composure than before. She still dressed impeccably, still walked tall, but the confident glow that once surrounded her had dimmed into something more guarded. Barrister Akin spoke softly beside her. "We push for maintenance recalibration and challenge discretionary distributions." She nodded, though her attention drifted across the aisle. Emeka sat already, reviewing a thin file in front of him. Not the thick binders from before. Just a slim, almost casual folder. That unsettled her more than stacks of paperwork ever could. When the judge entered, formalities were brief. "Counsel for the respondent," he said, looking toward Ifunanya, you indicated you have additional submissions. Yes, my lord. She stood with unhurried precision. While we have addressed structural ownership of corporate assets, there remains a matter of fiduciary integrity relevant to equitable consideration. Akin frowned immediately. My lord, we were not notified of any misconduct claims. You were served supplementary documentation 48 hours ago, Ifunanya replied evenly. Akin's jaw tightened. We consider it prejudicial. It is evidentiary, she corrected. The judge raised a hand. Proceed. Ifunanya opened the slim folder. My lord, during routine trust audits conducted last year, irregular financial movements were flagged from personal accounts associated with Mrs. Tosin Adeyemi-Okafor. A hush moved across the courtroom. Tosin's spine stiffened. These movements involved transfers totaling substantial sums into offshore holding accounts registered under her maiden name. Akin shot to his feet. My lord, personal financial privacy. If those funds originated from marital revenue streams, the judge interrupted, they are relevant. Ifunanya continued, voice calm and clinical. We have documentation of luxury acquisitions processed through intermediary vendors, payments structured in ways designed to avoid direct spousal visibility. She submitted printed transaction summaries. Tosin leaned toward Akin urgently. This is ridiculous. Stay calm, he whispered. The judge flipped through pages slowly. These accounts, he asked, were disclosed during initial asset declarations. No, my lord, Ifunanya replied. Akin intervened. My client has independent endorsement income and philanthropic grants. If so, Ifunanya said, we welcome verifiable proof of source. She turned a page deliberately. There is also the matter of a post-nuptial agreement signed 6 years into the marriage. Tosin's breath caught, barely noticeable, but real. Akin blinked. Post-nuptial. Yes, Ifunanya said. Executed following a brief separation period. Signed by both parties. Witnessed and notarized. She handed the document forward. The judge read carefully. Silence stretched. I recall signing routine documents during restructuring, Tosin muttered under her breath. Emeka did not look at her. The judge cleared his throat and read aloud a clause. In the event of verified financial misconduct, concealment of marital funds, or breach of fiduciary trust, the violating spouse forfeits primary claims to discretionary asset divisions. A ripple of shock passed through the gallery. Akin leaned closer to Tosin. Did you review this at the time? It was presented as estate planning, she whispered. The judge looked up. Mrs. Adeyemi-Okafor, do you contest the authenticity of your signature? Her voice felt dry. No, my lord. Do you contest that the accounts referenced are yours? She hesitated. They are investment vehicles, she said carefully. Were they disclosed to your husband? Silence. That is not a simple question, Akin interjected. It is, the judge replied firmly. Tosin's composure cracked just slightly. No, she said. The word hung heavy. Across the aisle, Emeka's expression did not change. But his fingers pressed together more tightly. Ifunanya stepped forward once more. My lord, this is not an attempt at character assassination. It is context. The petitioner demands equitable division based on partnership and transparency. Yet significant funds were moved without spousal knowledge. Akin stood again, frustration creeping into his tone. Marriages are not forensic audits. Individuals maintain personal autonomy. And autonomy does not include concealment of shared capital flows, Ifunanya replied calmly. The judge leaned back, eyes thoughtful. Counsel, he said to Akin, your client signed a post-nuptial agreement clearly outlining consequences of financial non-disclosure. Akin exhaled slowly. My lord, the language may be interpreted narrowly. It appears quite broad, the judge observed. Tosin felt the room closing in, not physically, but socially. She could feel the whispers forming already, the narrative shifting. She turned slightly toward Emeka for the first time that day. "You planned this," she said under her breath. He met her eyes evenly. "I protected what I built," he replied quietly. "With me," she said. "For us," he corrected. The judge called for a brief recess to review supplementary financial exhibits. In the private consultation room, Tosin's restraint faltered. "You told me this was manageable," she said sharply to Akin. "We didn't anticipate the post-nuptial being weaponized," he admitted. "I never imagined it mattered." He looked at her carefully. "Did you transfer funds without informing him?" She crossed her arms defensively. "I secured my own safety." "At whose expense?" She didn't answer. Across the hall, Ifunanya reviewed final notes. Once the misconduct clause is validated, she told Emeka, asset claims weaken significantly. He nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his face. "Ensure Jide remains untouched in this," he said quietly. "That is already structured," she replied. When court resumed, the judge's tone carried finality. "This court acknowledges the sophistication of the respondent's estate structures. We further acknowledge evidence suggesting financial non-disclosure by the petitioner." He looked toward Tosin. "Equity demands clean hands. Where concealment exists, claims diminish." The words were measured but devastating. Gasps were no longer subtle. Tosin's shoulders remained straight, but the certainty that had once defined her was gone. "This matter will proceed to final deliberation," the judge concluded. "But preliminary assessment indicates that full asset division is unlikely." The gavel fell. Outside the courtroom, chaos waited, microphones, cameras, speculative headlines forming in real time. Tosin exited first, ignoring shouted questions. "Madam, did you hide money? Is the post-nuptial real?" She kept walking. Moments later, Emeka emerged. "Chief, are you satisfied with today's proceedings?" He paused only briefly. "Satisfaction is not the goal," he said quietly. "Stability is." He entered his car without further comment. That evening, alone in her bedroom, Tosin opened her laptop and stared at the offshore account statements. What she once considered prudent now looked suspicious under judicial light. Across the city, Emeka sat in his study reviewing trust amendments. Without drama. Without celebration. Just precision. The case had shifted. It was no longer a battle over half a fortune. It was a reckoning over trust, financial and marital. And in that courtroom, Lagos society had witnessed something rare. Not a shouting match. Not a public scandal. But the quiet unraveling of a carefully curated image. The final judgment day arrived without spectacle, yet Lagos buzzed as though history were about to be written. Word had spread quietly through boardrooms, churches, salons, and gated estates. The Okafor divorce would be decided. Inside the High Court, the usual crowd gathered, though this time the energy was restrained. Curiosity had matured into anticipation. Tosin entered alone. No dramatic stride. No strategic wardrobe statement. Just a soft grey suit and a composed face that had learned how to hide disappointment. She acknowledged no one. Emeka arrived minutes later, his expression as steady as it had been from the beginning. He nodded once at Ifunanya before taking his seat. The judge entered promptly. "This court has reviewed all submissions, financial disclosures, trust documentation, and supplementary evidence," he began. "The matter before us is not merely dissolution of marriage but determination of equitable relief under complex financial architecture." The courtroom stilled. He adjusted the papers in front of him. First, regarding ownership of corporate entities and associated trusts, the court finds that the majority of assets referenced are legally held under irrevocable trust structures established prior to the filing of divorce. There is insufficient evidence to prove fraudulent intent in their formation. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Therefore, these assets are not subject to equal division. Tosin's fingers tightened around each other in her lap. Second, the judge continued, evidence presented demonstrates non-disclosure of substantial financial transfers by the petitioner during the marriage. This constitutes breach of fiduciary transparency under the post-nuptial agreement executed by both parties. The words were formal, but their meaning was sharp. The court upholds the validity of the post-nuptial agreement. Silence deepened. As a result, the petitioner's claim to 50% of marital assets is denied. A faint exhale escaped someone in the gallery. Tosin did not move. However, the judge added, this court recognizes the duration of the marriage and the shared upbringing of the minor child. A structured settlement will be awarded to ensure continued standard of living and maternal independence. He read the figure aloud, substantial by ordinary standards, modest by Okafor standards. A one-time settlement payable within 60 days. Tosin blinked slowly. Regarding custody of the minor child, Deceit Okafor, the court finds both parents fit. Joint custody is hereby ordered, with structured residential scheduling to ensure balanced parental presence. Emeka's posture remained composed, but something softened briefly in his eyes. No party shall exert financial leverage to undermine the co-parenting arrangement. The judge paused. This court does not exist to punish ambition or reward concealment. It exists to apply law. Marriage is partnership. But partnership requires transparency. He lowered his glasses slightly. Let this be understood, complex wealth structures are lawful. Concealment within marriage is not. He lifted the final page. The marriage between Chief Emeka Okafor and Tosin Adeyemi-Okafor is hereby dissolved. The gavel fell. It was not loud. But it ended everything. Outside, reporters surged forward. Madam Tosin, do you feel justice was served? She stopped for the first time in weeks. Justice, she said carefully, is rarely emotional. Will you appeal? She gave no answer, stepping into her waiting vehicle. Moments later, Emeka exited. Chief, you retained most of your fortune. Is this a victory? He looked directly at the cameras. There are no victories in broken homes, he said quietly. Did you anticipate this outcome? I prepared for responsibility. He entered his car, and the door closed with quiet finality. But the story did not end in that courtroom. 3 weeks later, in a private office overlooking the Atlantic, Emeka sat across from 2 trustees. I want the Deceit Legacy Trust amended, he said. The trustee adjusted his pen. In what capacity, Chief? Primary beneficiary designation to activate progressively at maturity milestones. Understood. And transfer additional holdings into the trust. The trustee hesitated. A significant portion? Yes. Ifunanya, seated beside him, glanced briefly in his direction but said nothing. Are you certain? The trustee asked. Emeka nodded. I built everything with the intention of continuity. Not conflict. Documents were signed. Funds moved quietly, not in dramatic headlines, but in silent digital transfers that reshaped the future. Meanwhile, Tosin settled into a new apartment in Ikoyi. Modern. Elegant. Smaller. One afternoon, Deceit sat beside her on the couch. Are you and Daddy angry? He asked softly. She looked at her son carefully. No, she said after a moment. We just chose different paths. Do you still love him? Children asked questions adults feared. She smiled faintly. Love changes. Across town, Emeka knelt in his study as Deceit excitedly showed him a school project. Daddy, when I grow up, will I run your companies? Emeka smiled, brushing a hand over his son's hair. You'll build your own. But you have so many. Wealth isn't about how many things you control, Emeka said gently. It's about what you protect. Deceit frowned thoughtfully. Like me. Exactly like you. Months passed. Society found new scandals to discuss. The Okafor divorce slowly faded from headlines. At a charity gala nearly a year later, Tosin and Emeka found themselves in the same room again. The music was soft. The lighting warm. They stood across the hall from each other for a moment before polite obligation brought them face to face. "You look well," Emeka said. "So do you," she replied. There was no bitterness in her tone now. Only acceptance. "I heard about the trust adjustments," she said quietly. He didn't deny it. "You always think 5 steps ahead," she added. "It's a habit." She studied him briefly. "You didn't do this to hurt me, did you?" "No," he said calmly. "I did it because I saw this coming." A small, ironic smile touched her lips. "I underestimated you." "Most people prefer comfort to preparation," he replied. "And you prefer control." "I prefer security." They stood in silence for a moment. "I never wanted to destroy you," she said. "You didn't," he answered. "We destroyed the illusion." That was the most honest thing either of them had said in years. As the evening continued, they moved separately through the crowd, no longer a unit, no longer a spectacle. In quiet conversations across Lagos, one lesson lingered. Never assume visible wealth equals accessible wealth. Never mistake calm for weakness. And never underestimate a person who prepares long before the storm arrives. But beyond the legal triumphs and social whispers, one truth remained simple. In the end, Emeka did not fight to keep half his fortune. He fought to protect what would outlive him. And that, more than any courtroom victory, was the only outcome that truly mattered.